The submission arrived on a Tuesday, which Liris-Ehn noted only because she later wanted to be precise about the timeline, and precision was the thing she had that was useful. She had sent the standard cultural apex offering documentation request to the Human Diplomatic Liaison Office 14 days prior, as per Protocol 7.4c of the Concord Induction Procedures Manual, which she had not needed to consult in 11 years because she had internalized it. The request specified one primary cultural artifact or documented achievement, technical specifications if display apparatus was required, translation materials if the offering was language dependent, and a brief historical context document of no more than 2,000 words. She had sent this same request 41 times. She had received 41 responses of varying quality and organizational coherence and had processed all of them within 72 hours. The human response came back in 4 days, which was faster than average. Liris-Ehn read it. She read it again, more slowly, on the theory that her first reading had contained an error. The document was 3 pages. The first page was Ambassador Okafor's credentials and a formal greeting in the Concord's diplomatic standard that was grammatically correct and pleasantly concise. The second page was the submission. It contained a title, a selection, and a technical rider requesting a standard atmospheric sound system with specific output parameters attached. The third page was the sound system specifications. She turned to the second page again. A selection, she looked for the cultural artifact documentation. She looked for the historical context. She looked for the technical specifications for a display apparatus, or an environmental containment unit, or a preservation field, or any of the 27 categories of physical presentation infrastructure she had coordinated in 41 previous inductions. She found the sound system specifications, which were thorough and correctly formatted and entirely beside the point of her concern. She sent a clarifying query. This was Protocol 7.4F, requests for supplementary documentation when initial submission is incomplete. She wrote it with the precise neutrality of a professional who is not yet alarmed, because she was not yet alarmed. She had received incomplete submissions before. The Keth delegation had submitted their offering documentation in a coordinate system that took 6 days to translate. This was manageable. Ambassador Okafor's office responded in 3 hours. The offering will be a curated selection of human musical recordings. Sound system specifications are attached. Liris-Ehn read this. She set her datapad flat on her desk. She looked at the wall opposite, which was smooth and gray and offered nothing. Then she sent a second query, which was not in the protocol. The protocol assumed one clarifying exchange was sufficient, asking specifically whether this constituted the complete submission or whether additional documentation was forthcoming. The response, yes, this is the complete submission. Ambassador Okafor's office thanks the Protocol Division for its diligence. She sat with this for a moment that was longer than she would later admit to Vorrathi. It was not quite alarm. It was the sensation of a category refusing to close, the specific cognitive discomfort of a thing that should fit somewhere and does not, held carefully in 2 hands while she worked out where to put it. Then she opened her personal log, because the personal log was where she put things that were not ready to be official, and she began to compose what she described to herself as a professional note of concern. She wrote, "The Human Cultural Apex Offering submission has been confirmed as a curated selection of musical recordings delivered via standard atmospheric sound system, with no accompanying physical artifact, text, visual display, navigational data, mathematical notation, philosophical framework, or any other substantive cultural documentation. I have reviewed the submission against all 41 current offering categories. The closest available classification is Auditory Cultural Expression, Ceremonial, Category 17, which was established for the Belhari induction when they presented their species-founding ritual chant. I do not believe this classification is adequate. I have also reviewed Protocol 7.4 in its entirety and can confirm that nothing in the current procedural framework prevents an auditory-only offering. I would like the record to show that nothing in the current procedural framework anticipated one either." She read this back. She added, "I will make the necessary arrangements." She saved the log. She opened the technical writer and began coordinating the sound system installation, because she was a professional and this was the procedure. Vorrathi appeared at her office threshold 20 minutes later with the specific expression of someone who had seen the submission and needed confirmation that he had read it correctly. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Yes," said Liris-Ehn, in a tone that was entirely accurate in its formal meaning and communicated something else entirely through the register of her voice, the stillness of her hair, and the deliberate way she was looking at her datapad rather than at him. Vorrathi nodded and withdrew. He was in his first year, and already, she thought, learning the right things. The morning of the ceremony, Liris-Ehn arrived at the induction chamber 40 minutes before the preparation briefing to run her standard pre-ceremony check. She verified the sound system installation. The technicians had done excellent work, better than she'd expected given the compressed timeline, and confirmed atmospheric composition, seating configurations for all 47 delegations, translation relay synchronization, and the integrity of the ceremonial lighting sequence. She checked her form. She reviewed the offering category options one more time in the hope that she had missed one. She had not missed one. At 0900, she went to the preparation chamber to conduct the pre-ceremony briefing with Ambassador Okafor. He was already there. He was 63 years old and had the build of someone who had spent decades at a keyboard, a slight forward lean in the shoulders, hands that rested with a particular deliberateness, as though aware of their own usefulness. He was dressed in the dark formal attire of a senior human diplomat, but he had set on the preparation table beside him a small personal audio device, compact, well used, with a surface that caught the light in ways that suggested age, which he had clearly brought himself, separate from the installed system, and which he regarded with a comfortable familiarity that Liris-Ehn filed immediately as, "This object matters to him." He looked up when she entered and smiled, which she had encountered enough times in human diplomatic interactions to recognize as a greeting and not a challenge, and which, with this particular human, communicated something she couldn't immediately categorize as warmth, or as the practiced ease of a person who had been in difficult rooms before and had made a decision not to let rooms determine his state. Ambassador Okafor. She set her checklist on the table. "I'm Clerk Liris-Ehn, Protocol Division. I'll be managing the ceremony proceedings today. I have a standard pre-briefing to conduct." "Of course," he said. "Please." She went through the briefing. Timing. The ceremony would open with Secretary General Amathrel's standard address, approximately 8 minutes, followed by the formal introduction, and then the offering presentation. Technical. The sound system had been installed to her specifications. She had the output parameters he'd submitted. The chamber's atmospheric mix would affect bass resonance by a factor she'd already accounted for in the installation calibration. Procedural. When the presentation concluded, he should return to the ambassador's seat. The Secretary General would close the session. He listened to all of this with the quality of attention she associated with people who were genuinely interested in what she was saying, which was not the quality she usually encountered during pre-ceremony briefings. He asked about the chamber's acoustics, not as a challenge, but with the curiosity of someone who wanted to understand the space. He asked which species present had the strongest auditory range. She told him, the Velhari, who could detect frequencies 3 times outside the human range, and the Thessari, she said this without inflection, who had highly sensitive auditory membranes but typically dampened them in formal settings. "Will the atmosphere mix affect the way the sound propagates?" he asked. She told him it would affect the higher frequencies slightly, that she had calibrated for it. He nodded, absorbing this with the seriousness of someone incorporating it into something. Then he said, "Have you heard music before? Your species, I mean." She explained, as she had explained to other humans at other points in her 19 years, that the Thessari perceived sound as mathematical wave interference, that their auditory processing was analytical rather than aesthetic by biology, and that while she was fully capable of processing auditory information, the aesthetic response that many species associated with music was not a category of experience available to her. She had said versions of this sentence many times. It was accurate, clinically complete, and always received with a slightly disappointed nod. Ambassador Okafor listened to it without the slightly disappointed nod. He listened to it with great attention, which was already unusual, and then he said, "That's all music is." Technically, he said it not as a gotcha, not with the satisfaction of a person who has scored a point, but with the specific tone of someone who genuinely found the observation interesting. He smiled again, the warm one, and she understood that he was not trying to reassure her or to undercut her expertise. He was just noting that the gap between how she described her experience and what music was might be smaller than she thought. She did not find this reassuring. She was also aware in some part of her that her professional attention was not quite managing, that she had no immediate response to it, which was unusual. He picked up his audio device. "I call it the good speaker," he said. "The installed system is better by every technical measure. This one's been with me for a long time." He looked at it. "Some things you bring because they're the best available. Some things you bring because they're yours." Her hair lifted, very slightly, before she caught it and smoothed it down. She thanked him for his time, collected her checklist, and went to take her protocol station. The chamber at 10 minutes before ceremony was the thing she genuinely loved, which she had never told anyone because love was not a category that belonged in professional documentation. It was the choreography of it, 47 species finding their designated positions with the specific discipline of civilizations that had agreed, across 600 years, to the value of being in the same room together and behaving accordingly. The Vorrathi delegation, 6 members in their luminescent environmental suits, settling at their designated arc with the synchronized precision they brought to everything. The Sulathi adjusting their electromagnetic field regulators, the faint crackle of interference as they calibrated to the chamber's own field signature. The Pretheki delegates, 3 of them, which was their standard diplomatic number, distributed through time in a way that made their physical presence slightly variable depending on the moment, finding their orientation with the particular patience of beings for whom the present was merely one of several concurrent positions. She watched all of it from her protocol station and felt, as she always did, the thing she had felt when she chose this work, that this was the best impulse her civilization had participated in, not the Concord's power, not its bureaucratic complexity. Its decision, repeated 600 years running, that a new voice was worth the room it required. She loaded her form, offering type, auditory cultural expression, ceremonial, provisional, subject to revisional. She was not satisfied with this. She left the cursor in the field. Secretary General Drell opened the session with the standard formula, which she could have recited with him word for word, and which, delivered in his measured baritone, still managed to sound like something worth saying. He introduced humanity, their 11-year provisional period, their application history, their provisional member record, and then he introduced Ambassador Okafor. Darnell walked to the center of the chamber. He carried the good speaker in one hand. He had transferred the playlist to the installed system already. She knew this because she had supervised the transfer herself. The speaker was not functional necessity. It was the thing he was bringing because it was his. He stood at the center of the induction chamber, the largest formal space in the Concord's architecture, designed to hold 47 species and the weight of first contact with something new. And he paused there for a moment that she watched carefully because it told her something. He was not performing composure. He was finding it, which was different. His eyes moved across the chamber in the way she had seen musicians do in performances she'd attended as part of her diplomatic functions, reading the room before addressing it, taking it in rather than projecting at it. He looked slightly out of place in the best possible way. A human with a speaker and a playlist, standing in the most important room in the galaxy, not trying to look like he belonged there, just standing in it. She realized her hand had stopped moving over the form. She moved it again. He did not have notes. She had expected notes. "I won't take long," he said. His voice was not an orator's voice. It was a room voice, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard across a table or across a small stage, carrying the specific intimacy of a speaker who is talking to you rather than at the space above your head. The chamber's acoustics caught it and treated it gently. "I know the format calls for a prepared statement, and I did prepare one. It was 6 pages and I threw it out 2 weeks ago." A ripple of something moved through the translation feeds. She monitored them from her station, the particular quality of 47 species, adjusting their reception to accommodate an informality they hadn't expected. "Humanity has spent 11 years submitting documentation to this body," he said. "Technology transfer packages, navigation charts, medical research, political framework analyses. A lot of political framework analyses, and I want to apologize on behalf of my species for how long those took, and also explain that we will probably continue to be that way about politics, and there's nothing much to be done." Another ripple, lighter, the translation feeds catching humor across 17 different registers. If you want to know what humans can contribute practically, all of that documentation exists, and it's accurate, and I'm proud of it. But that's not what the offering is. He shifted his weight slightly. It was the movement of a person settling into something true. I was asked for our greatest cultural achievement, and when I sat with that question, really sat with it for a long time, I found I couldn't choose one thing, not because we have too many to count, though we do, but because I don't think human culture works like a summit. It doesn't have a peak. It has a conversation. He paused. The chamber was very quiet. The Vorrathi delegate, Vorrathi, whose presence she had noted at his delegation's arc, was perfectly still in the way Vorrathi were still, which looked like held breath. Humans have been having this conversation for as long as we have made sound. Across every century, every language, every border that we drew and argued about and occasionally redrew. The conversation is about what it feels like to be alive, to lose someone, to be afraid, to be very tired and still going, to be in love, which turns out to feel approximately the same in every century we've recorded, and presumably before that too. Something moved in his face, not a smile, but the shape of one. We made this for each other. We never stopped making it. And it works, not just across time, but across the distance between one person and another, which is sometimes very large. He looked down at the good speaker in his hand, briefly. The way you look at something you have carried for a long time. I thought you should hear it, he said. He pressed play. Liris-Ehn became aware that her hand was resting on the form and not moving, and that this had been true for some time. The first sound was the oldest. A group of human voices. She ran an immediate analytical assessment. 14 distinct voice signatures, she noted, primarily lower registers, singing together in a language her translator flagged as archaic, a Creole strain with insufficient corpus for full reconstruction. Singing was not the precisely right word. The word she had was singing, but what she heard was something closer to a shared exhalation, a sound that a group of bodies makes when they are doing physical work together and have found, through repetition, that making sound in unison cost less than making it alone. There was no instrumentation. There were the voices and the sound of labor behind them. Something rhythmic, blunt, and the melody, which was not complex. She noted, technically unsophisticated. She noted, auditory membranes fluttering slightly. She dampened them. She returned her attention to the form. The field recording ended and something else began. A single instrument, European lineage, based on string resonance characteristics, playing slowly and with great deliberateness. She assessed the mathematical intervals. They were precise, following a tonal logic she could track, and then they went somewhere she hadn't predicted. The melody moved to a resolution she had been building a model for and then did not arrive there, landing instead a half step from where she'd expected. And the not arriving felt like something she didn't have a category for. Something that lived in the part of her processing that was below her monitoring. She was still looking at the form. The offering type field was still provisional. Her hair drifted upward, she realized, approximately 2 centimeters. She could feel it. She smoothed it down with a controlled movement and returned to the form. The chamber changed while she wasn't looking at it. She noticed it first as a quality of air, not the air itself, which was atmospherically stable, and she had the monitoring data to confirm this, but the particular quality of attention from 47 species, which had a texture she'd learned to read across 19 years the way a skilled navigator reads current. In the early minutes it had been polite diplomatic attendance, present, calibrated, professionally receptive, the kind of attention a chamber full of ancient civilizations gives to something it is prepared to assess. That quality had changed. She became aware of it without being able to say when it began changing, the way you become aware that the light has shifted because you can no longer read at the same angle as before. She looked up. Your wrath of the Vorrathi was making sounds. She registered this first as a malfunction, some interface error in the environmental suit, because the Vorrathi did not make sounds. They communicated in pure mathematics, had developed language as an extension of numerical notation, and the history of their vocal apparatus in Concord records was minimal. She had the file. She had read it during her preparatory review of the delegation briefings. What she heard from Urath's direction was not mathematics. It was something older than mathematics, a sound that lived in the chest, in the part of the body that predates organized thought, rising and falling in a frequency she couldn't immediately assign a structural function to. Harmonics. The word arrived. Spontaneous harmonic vocalization. Other delegates had turned to look at Urath. Urath had not noticed. Urath's environmental suit was generating light, the bioluminescent communication layer the Vorrathi used when they weren't actively speaking, in patterns she didn't recognize from the briefing. Materials. Her eyes desynchronized. One locked on Urath. The other moved. She felt it ranging. The prey response, the ancient circuit tripping without her permission, across the chamber, finding the Sulathi delegates with their field regulators quiet for the first time in her memory of them, finding the Pretheki delegate in the third row who was writing, rapidly and with great focus, in a notepad she was holding below the sight line of the seat in front of her, finding the small Sulathi observer in the balcony tier who had covered their sensory crests with both hands and was sitting in that position with a stillness that communicated absorption rather than distress. She was in a chamber full of species, 47 of them, and they were all in their biologies, in the ways their particular nervous systems had solved the problem of being alive, being reach. She could not explain this. She looked back at the form. The category field was empty. Her sleeves were not enough. She could see, without looking, the bioluminescence at her wrists. Not the subtle underlayer glow she managed in professional settings, but something brighter, something she had not shown in a working context in a very long time. She drew her arms close to her sides. The music continued. It had moved. She was tracking it in the part of her that was still performing analysis through West African percussion, through something with a stringed instrument she recognized as European classical by structure and felt, in the unmonitored part of her, as rain, and then through a style the translation system labeled as jazz. Two instruments in conversation with each other, asking and answering, agreeing and disagreeing, neither one finishing the other's thought without adding something of its own. She had a term for this, call and response. It was in the xenolinguistics reference materials. She had known it as a structural category for 11 years. She had not understood it until this moment, which was a different thing. Between two tracks, the music stopped. The silence lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, the chamber made a sound she had never heard it make, the collected breath of 47 species, some of whom breathed and some of whom processed atmosphere in other ways, and some of whom did things she had no direct biological understanding of. All of it together, the sound of a room full of living things. She became aware of Sorath then. She looked sideways. She never looked sideways during a ceremony. There was no procedural reason to look sideways, and found that Sorath Ven was sitting on the floor of the protocol station. He had folded himself down with his back against the station housing, his official form abandoned in a configuration that suggested it had slipped, unnoticed, from his hands at some point he hadn't recorded. Both his eyes, large, gold, hers in miniature, the shared biology of their species, were at their widest, fixed on the center of the chamber, where Darnell sat in the ambassador's seat, with his hands in his lap. He looked at her. She looked at him. They were both quiet for a moment that contained no professional purpose, and that she did not attempt to convert into one. "Are you?" she started. He shook his head, very slightly, not as a no but as a signal that language wasn't available just now. She understood this. She was experiencing something similar. The next track began. She faced forward. She had stopped thinking about the form entirely. She was not performing professional detachment. She was simply here, in the chamber, present in a way that she could not have said was different from her ordinary presence, except that her ordinary presence had always been organized around the question of what she was supposed to be, doing, and this presence had no question in it at all. Her membranes were fully open. She noticed this around the 20th minute and did not close them. The playlist reached its end. She knew it was ending because she had the track count and the running time, and she had been passively monitoring both, in some minor corner of her processing, while the rest of her was doing the thing she still could not name. The contemporary section had moved through several styles she had cultural documentation for, and had felt them land in ways the documentation had not prepared her for. One track, mid-century, she assessed, the translation system said American Soul, had done something to the chamber that she could only describe as a change in pressure. the specific sensation of a room deciding collectively that it was allowed to feel something. And then the final track began. One voice, one instrument, low and stringed, the acoustic signature of a small room. She could hear the particular quality of reflected sound, a space no larger than an office, uncalibrated, intimate. The voice was a human woman's voice, middle-aged by register, singing a melody that her analysis system flagged as original composition, no notation, West African tonal influence. Accompaniment minimal, recording quality consistent with informal documentation circa late 20th century Earth. And then, underneath the analysis, something older and simpler arrived. She did not know who this was. She would not know for 3 days, until she read the supplementary documentation she requested after the ceremony, and found, in Darnell's personal files at his office's permission, a single note. His mother, recorded at a church rehearsal, Lagos, 1987, died 2003. 41 years. She did not know any of this while the recording played. She knew only the voice, the specific quality of a voice singing alone in a room, not for an audience, not performing, simply making the sound, and someone having had the presence of mind to capture it. The melody was simple. It resolved where she expected it to resolve, and the resolving felt like something coming to rest. She experienced, in the 2 minutes and 40 seconds of the recording, something she would spend 3 days attempting to classify, and eventually file under a category she invented herself. It was not sadness. She had a category for sadness. It was a particular weight with a particular shape. She knew it. It was not joy. It was something that felt like the experience of recognizing a thing she had not known, she had forgotten, the internal sensation of a word appearing in a language she had not spoken in a very long time, or perhaps had never spoken, but had always known. Her hair was fully fanned. She was aware of this and did not correct it. The bioluminescence had reached her elbows. Her membranes were open and their flutter was audible. She would receive a handwritten apology note from the Thessaly cultural attaché 3 rows away the next morning, expressing regret for staring, which she would read and find she could not be embarrassed about. She did not move. She did not file anything. The voice in the recording held its final note for a long breath and released it, and a chair creaked, old wood, a small sound, and the track ended. The chamber was silent. Darnell picked up the good speaker from the floor at the center of the chamber. He straightened up. He looked at no one in particular, or perhaps at everyone equally, which was the same thing. He walked back to the ambassador's seat and sat down. He said nothing. He did not appear to feel that anything further needed saying. The silence lasted longer than any silence she had recorded in 19 years of inductions. She knew this with certainty because she had a 19-year record and she was, even now, monitoring it. The previous record was 41 seconds after the Vorrathi delegation's mathematical offering, which had restructured the physical laws of 3 star systems and left the chamber momentarily without language. This silence was longer. Secretary General Amath Drell, when he finally spoke, did not use the standard closing formula. She heard him, from her station, find his way toward words with the specific quality of a person sorting through a drawer in the dark. He found them. He said, "The Concord recognizes the offering." Just that. Quietly. Like the correct thing, and also entirely inadequate. And he knew both. The delegates filed out. She stood at her protocol station. Sulathi then stood up from the floor. She watched him do it, and smoothed his professional attire with the dignity of someone choosing not to acknowledge the last 74 minutes as a departure from normal procedure, which was the right choice, and she respected it. "Do you need anything?" he asked. "I would like a moment," she said. He nodded and went. He did not ask any procedural questions, which she noted and appreciated. She stood alone as the chamber emptied around her. The Pretheki delegate passed her station, and she saw, in the delegate's hands, a notepad dense with writing, script she did not recognize, which she confirmed later was a language the Pretheki had not previously possessed, 12 pages composed during the performance in a tongue that had apparently needed to exist and hadn't until now. The Vorrathi delegation moved past in their cluster, and she observed that Urath was still producing, very quietly, the harmonic sound, not as a vocal outburst now, but as something residual, like the ringing of a bell after the strike. Urath's delegation was moving close around the delegate, not in their standard formation, but in a configuration she could only read as together. When the chamber was empty, she walked to the center. She had never walked to the center of the chamber before. That was not part of her role. The center of the chamber was for the species presenting their offering and the Secretary General conducting the session, and she was neither of these things. She was the person at the edge making sure everything was correctly documented, which was the correct and necessary function and which had never brought her to the center before. She walked to the center of the chamber and stood in the space where Darnell had stood, and she looked at his small audio device on the floor where he had set it down and not taken it. He would come back for it. It was his, and he would come back. But it was here now. She did not touch it. She looked at it for a while. The sound system installation around her was very quiet. The chamber's atmosphere processors ran their low ambient hum. Somewhere in the walls, the ceremony lights were cycling down to their maintenance setting. She stood there for a time she did not log. 3 days later, 2 rejected drafts. The first draft she had abandoned because the language in the summary assessment field was not precise. She had written things that were emotionally accurate and professionally inadequate, and the combination served neither purpose. The second draft she had abandoned because the language in the summary assessment field was precisely adequate and entirely false. Correct sentences about an experience that the sentences could not contain. On the third morning, she opened the form and filled it in from the top. Offering type, auditory. She left the provisional notation in the subsystem record and overrode the ceremonial subclassification. It was auditory. That was what it was. Cultural classification. Multi-tradition musical anthology, spanning approximately 4 centuries of documented human musical production. She wrote a careful paragraph. Correct and complete. Historical context. She wrote 3 paragraphs, accurately summarizing what she had confirmed through post-ceremony research, the scope of the playlist, the traditions it moved through, the cultural lineage of each movement, the technical and historical documentation that Darnell had submitted in a supplementary packet the next morning, unprompted, because he thought she might want it. She had read it twice. Estimated civilizational significance. She looked at the field options. She selected transformative. She did not hesitate. She had never selected transformative before. She held the cursor over it for a moment and selected it and moved on. Summary assessment. The cursor was in the field. She began to write. She reached the 500-character limit. The form generated a soft alert. She entered the administrative override code. She had never used it before. She'd had to look it up in the procedural manual. And continued. She wrote, I have overseen 42 cultural apex offerings. In that time, I have assessed equations that expanded our understanding of physical reality, artworks of extraordinary technical mastery, and philosophical frameworks that reshaped 3 civilizations' self-conception. I classified all of them correctly and promptly. I cannot classify this offering, not because it is beyond assessment, but because assessment is not what it requires. Ambassador Okafor brought a playlist. He brought 40 voices singing about what it costs to be alive and how it is worth it anyway. He brought the thing humans make when they have no other way to say, I feel this too. You are not alone. I have attempted to find the correct Concord category for this for 3 days. The correct category does not exist. I recommend we create one. I recommend we call it evidence that a civilization has looked honestly at its own experience and decided to tell the truth about it. The humans have been doing this for as long as they have made sound. I believe the Concord should know this about them. I believe the Concord should know this about itself. She read it back. It was not within the template. It had never been written in any Concord induction record. It would either be flagged as a procedural irregularity and returned for revision, or it would not. She filed the report. She closed the form. She sat for a moment in the quiet of her office. Her window faced the Concord's central atrium, where the Sulathi coral sculpture had been growing for 2 centuries, vast and pale and alive, spreading into shapes that had no purpose except their own continued becoming. She looked at it, as she had looked at it many times in 19 years without stopping to look at it. She opened a new document. It had no header field, no category drop-down, no character limit. It had no procedural location. Nothing in the Concord filing architecture was waiting for it. She set her forearms on the desk, and the pores there, which had been dilated since the ceremony and had not fully closed, caught the office air and sent something through her that was not a message she could translate. She began to write. It was not a report. It had no classification. It was not for any record. It was the sound a mind makes when it has been told something true and needs somewhere to put it. Not to file it, not to assess it, just to hold it in language for a while. The way you hold a stone from a place you have been, knowing the stone is not the place, and not minding because the stone is yours and you were there, and it is enough to have a thing to hold. She wrote for a long time. Her membranes opened and closed softly in the empty office. A flutter she didn't try to stop. A small private opening and closing, like breathing, like listening, like a thing that is learned, after a long time, that it is allowed to hear. Outside her window, the coral kept growing.